Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. So this is a panel discussion about developing on the RChain platform, and I've got a wonderful group of panelists here from a variety of different backgrounds related to developing on RChain and at a variety of different points of developing on the RChain platform. I do want to do a quick, I guess for lack of a better word, demographic survey so that we can better understand this audience. So show of hands, please, if this is the first day you've ever heard of RChain. Excellent. Okay, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Show of hands, please, if you have experience developing applications on a decentralized platform such as Ethereum. Excellent, thank you. Show of hands, please, if the term Rolang is new to you today. Okay, great. And show of hands, please, if you've played with Rolang at any level. Fantastic, Derek, well done. Derek is actually writing the book on the syntax and semantics of the Rolang language, so he has a bit of experience. Okay, another question. Raise your hand, please, if your primary role, either professionally or as a hobbyist, is in development. Okay, show of hands, please, if you consider yourself more of an architect. Okay, okay. And quick show of hands, please, if you're working in an organization or you're thinking of spinning up an organization where your business goal relies on you being able to do decentralized computing on a blockchain solution. Okay. Is that anything else you want to know? Okay. Excellent. All right. So with that, I'm going to also say that this is really designed to be fairly informal. I'm going to return the time over to our panelists to introduce themselves and talk about what they've been working on, and we'll talk a little bit about their experience so far, but also this is intended to be a conversation with you. The value of this you being here is the opportunity to talk with these people and to talk and learn amongst yourselves. So we'll also have ample time for Q&A. It's important for those who are watching via live stream or who will be enjoying the recording later that we capture questions with a microphone. So we'll be passing around a microphone when we get to that portion of our session today. Okay? So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you. Number one, thank you for being here today. I'm really grateful that you're taking the time and glad to see you all in person. Most of these people I know just in email and voice only, so great. And why don't you just take turns speaking for just a few minutes, who you are, what organization you're with, and what you've been doing with the project that you're working on as it relates to RChain at this point.
Do we need the screen? It's kind of...
Yeah. Is it possible to turn the screen off, or is it needed? We don't have any presentations for this.
So, hi, my name is Peter, and I'm the founder of Resonate, and we're a streaming music cooperative that has been funded via Reflective Ventures, one of the VC firms working with the co-op, or rather even owned by the co-op. And so that started in February of this year, and here we are in September, and it feels like that was about 3 years ago that I was in Seattle at the governance conference being told that the deal was done. You know, the blockchain cycles are on a whole other time scale than anything else, I think, in the natural world. So it's been a whirlwind up until now, and then that whirlwind in the last 2 days kind of turned into something else entirely. As you all, if you were at the opening keynote this morning, the implications of what we talked about are tremendous, and it's going to take a little bit of time to fully wrap my head around the fact that everything that we were doing was moving in a certain direction. I had kind of projected would take 2 to 3 years, and the advent of audio on chain is going to shrink those timescales down to months in terms of how fast we're going to be able to leap forward into that. So it's an exciting new world for us. Claire's going to be talking about, I think, an absolutely fundamental component, and also Chris too, to blockchain systems and consumer applications, and that's identity. So I'll skip that for a moment and then just look at the kind of utility function of the future Resonate culture token, which is still a work in progress, and I think will always be a work in progress, because the goal of it will be to kind of find an equilibrium within the community of spend and earn. You want give and take in economic systems, and for us as a co-op, where the listeners, the artists, the labels, the contributors are all in different stakeholder classes, we want to create an equilibrium across all members for the growth of the network, the growth of the community worldwide. And that's not designable by a single group of people working in a couple of rooms. Even though our team is distributed, we're still kind of centralized in the sense we're a co-op, so we have not decentralized governance, but we have democratic governance. And yet, it's really clear that as we've been working on the token model, that it's not something we're going to be able to figure out from the get-go. But the beauty of the cooperative model is that we can change it, and we can do so in an open and transparent and democratic fashion. And that's something that I feel is super exciting about how Resonate operates, and it's also really exciting about how RChain operates. So there's a great symbiosis there. And so I think that's as much as I'd like to say about to kind of give some opening comments. I think it's much more interesting and relevant to turn it over to comments and questions to really address the ideas and concerns and questions that everybody else here has. So we'll just pass it on to Chris from LifeID.
We're good? Okay. So my name's Chris Bascolo. I'm the founder of LifeID. LifeID is an open source tokenized identity platform for self-sovereign identity. The idea is that each one of us has a digital identity that we transact through our daily lives, that we should have ownership of the data that is concerning us, and that we should be in control over what parts of that data we want to share with other people. And so that's the open protocol and platform that we're building to accomplish that. Apps will be built on our platform, such as Passport, for example, and those apps will carry forward this idea that the data they collect about the individuals, that individuals will have the ownership of that data and be able to choose who and with whom they share it with. So that's LifeID. We're building on RChain for a couple of reasons. One is scale. We're building a platform that, there's 7+ billion people on Earth. Does anybody know? I don't know what the number is today, but at the end of the day, to achieve, to have this platform cover the Earth, we need a blockchain substrate that can scale to enormous number of users or number of identifiers in our world. So that is really important for us, and that's why we're building on RChain.
So hi everyone, my name is Claire Tolan. I'm one of 2 CTOs at Resonate. I direct blockchain technology specifically. In my role at Resonate, I am kind of overseeing our transition of our services onto RChain. The first component of that is with something called the Creative Passport. The Creative Passport is a collaboration with Imogen Heap's Mycelia for Music organization. It's a self-sovereign identity for artists and musicians, which allows single sign-on to a number of services in the Creative Passport ecosystem. So at the moment, we're working very closely with LifeID in order to integrate with their beta net, or their beta platform, which will be on the Ethereum testnet and then taken onto the RChain mainnet next year, which is approximately the timeline that we're looking at. So the idea with the Creative Passport is that an artist should have control over their data in a self-sovereign way, much like Chris just said, and be able to send that data into different services that they use and kind of have a central place to edit everything as it is decentrally stored. So we're working quite a lot with the concept of verified claims and having artists sign claims to their data and attach themselves to it that way. So yeah, that's just a quick introduction, but I'm sure we'll say more as this continues. So thanks.
Hi, my name is Luigi Demeo. I'm the co-founder of Proof, and that's another Reflective Ventures portfolio company. And we're building a platform to verify the truthfulness of content online, so more of a consumer application. And what we really imagine is a world where we can have analytics on sources in journalism or blogs or any type of content on the internet and be able to filter through that content. So I'll be explaining a little bit more of how that works tomorrow at our talk, but in general, we chose RChain once again because of scale. We realized that Ethereum wasn't feasible for what we wanted to do, and you can achieve scalability and security, and they're really not necessarily two things that need to oppose. So that's why we we chose RChain, and that's why we're here today.
Hello, glad to see you here. My name is Joshi Orndorff. I work for the co-op, and my work recently has included writing a Rolang tutorial, which went live on rchain.coop today, and some example dApps. Thanks. And also, just posted up on rchain.coop is a link to my GitHub where there's a repo called Write Your First dApp. And so it's kind of a hand-holding, step-by-step, here's the code to get a basic dApp up and working. So my value add here is basically if you have in-the-weeds questions or you want to know what it's like to work with Rnode's gRPC or something like that, I can help you out. I'm sort of natively a Python guy, but lately I've been working in JavaScript. So, yeah.
So one of the things that you all spoke about reasons that you chose the RChain platform. I guess a good follow-on is thinking about architecting for that platform. And so I know you are in different stages of development, but one of the early stages obviously is architecting and thinking about those considerations that you might have encountered, what you've learned about architecting for RChain in particular, or what you've discovered along the way that you wish you'd thought of earlier. You don't have to go in order. You can.
I know, I'm just trying to think of my response.
So I'll speak a little bit to that. Let me first talk a little bit about how we got to where we're at. I imagine a lot of people in this room probably, and I saw a lot of hands get raised on Ethereum developers. So we prototyped most of what our platform will do on Ethereum. With the intention that we would prove out the smart contract part of our offering and then port it over to Rolang. So in terms of architectural similarities, the access point between our solution and the web interface we expose to the world and the smart contract layer is through an API layer that we're developing. So in the Ethereum world, you have Web3, which is a JavaScript library that they developed to basically interact with the chain. On RChain, to this date, until Joshi's recent contribution this week, or last week, I guess, there hasn't been that. So that's been a huge step to help the development community at large be able to start actually writing apps that interact with the chain itself. So that's been the one area, I guess, framed in the what I wish we knew. Honestly, I don't know that there's anything we wish we would have known, because we knew going into it with RChain where the development was. So we knew ahead of time that tools like this would be needed to make our job simpler. So we definitely appreciate the community effort to bring those tools to fruition. Not so much anything we wish we had known, just we wish, these tools were available today and,
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting spot to be in for us as one of the first dApps or first companies to start going into RChain to, like Chris said, realize, oh, right, there's not a wallet yet, or like, right, none of this stuff just exists automatically. And I think it makes you feel very close to the entire process, because that in part means that the onus is on us as well, and Resonate, as we've thought about developing for RChain, it's never been, oh, we're just developing this technology for Resonate, rather. It's always been, oh, we're developing this to contribute back to the RChain community, and with the assumption that, nobody else is going to do this for us. So that's not so much what we wish we knew before, but just what our attitude is towards working with RChain, yeah.
Well, then somebody has to go first, right? And so very much appreciated that you guys were willing to forge new ground there, because it is difficult, and it is a new, and it's difficult to work on a platform that is really, not truly done. And so, the fact that they've had to iterate along the way as the platform has grown and developed, and that is no small feat either.
Yeah, and I'd even add, so yeah, we talked about like first steps, and we're kind of bootstrapping the tooling around the platform, and like that's an invitation to everybody here to join in and do the same. There's some like basic tools that a bunch of us have written now, and they're okay, and they're not great, and they'll get better by people using them and breaking them, and telling us what they need to do different, and joining up and stuff. So, welcome to that journey.
I think the interesting distinction between RChain and Ethereum in this context is that with Ethereum, you had the build of the core infrastructure and then business development as distinct stages. And those two things here are happening at the same time. And that's why it's so fundamentally different. And you're hearing some of these kinds of comments that this is all being developed in real time. And the opportunities there are really, really interesting, because the development of a dApp can influence the development of the platform. The attending chaos, or rather complexity of that, on the organizational side can be a challenge, but I think we're also working through that side of it as well in real time.
Yeah, and then I can speak a little bit about our experience as well. It's very similar to Chris's in the sense that we're architecting a platform that kind of we're doing it in parallel, trying to prototype on Ethereum and then port over to RChain. And we realized the same thing that Josh mentioned, that there wasn't many tools, so we said, all right, well, let's build some. So I think it was maybe yesterday or today, one of our developers released something similar to what Joshy built, which was in Python, however, a way to connect to RChain via gRPC. So that's something that's in Discord now. You can talk to the blockchain through that, and it works. So we'd be happy for any commentary on that as well.
And just to pile on a little bit to some of the other things that were said, because most of these efforts up here are open source efforts, it means anybody in this room can contribute to it. And it's pretty exciting, especially with the movement that RChain is going to be and is, to get your feedback to be part of that movement. And it's really exciting. It comes with a cost, right, getting in this early. But the upside is getting to have influence over the way things are and the way things work, being able to interact with the dev team to push the APIs in a direction that will be easier for us as developers to consume. So that's really exciting to be involved in a project at that stage where you get to influence heavily where things are moving to. So, there's definitely some upside to having joined this early.
I do want to speak a little bit. So if you are brand new or relatively new to RChain, or if you've, everybody had this experience, I think, because I hear it time and time again, there are a lot of communication channels related to RChain, and especially development related to RChain. So, all of these are open source projects, so clearly you can go and find, right? And then Joshy has just talked about sharing his GitHub, and you can go and find his work, as well as on the new cooperative website that launched today. There's information there. I also want to call out that there is the developer.rchain.coop website, and there's a very active and wonderfully engaged community of developers on the RChain's official Discord, and the link to that Discord is in, obviously, the RChain website page and the developer web page, and I really highly recommend that. As I've watched, Joshy's work especially, and Luigi's work too, watching you guys work together and being involved in that community through Discord, that's a great place. That's a great next step place for you if you're in this room today and you're thinking about building on RChain. Just an incredibly supportive community, and it's a great way to share resources. Because we're a co-op and we're building distributed software, oftentimes it gets a little noisy just in terms of where do I go to find help. But I highly recommend that Discord channel.
And I want to add to and emphasize the word co-op, cooperative in that. Don't just join Discord, join the co-op. Become a voting member, become a co-owner in the project, because and then contrast that against maybe trying to influence the Ethereum Foundation. Not that they're bad people or anything, but structurally, how are you going to do that? If you're in Berlin, they're open and accessible. I mean, I remember the first time I went to the first meetup at the Ethereum dev office, and it was like, oh, I could just walk in and like there's a meeting here, and like those are where the desks where these people sit that are making all this stuff happen. But the organizational governance aspect that is RChain is a fundamentally different thing, and so take advantage of it, including voting in October for the board members.
So we talked about architecture. We also have a number of people who are dApp developers, and we talked about prototyping on Ethereum because it was ready and something to do. I guess I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about what you've noticed in a difference of. We talked about tooling, and just a need for tools, but also perhaps a difference in the way that you develop on Ethereum versus developing on RChain. And I know you guys are all still different points in your project. So whoever.
Yeah, so developing on RChain is different than other developing that I've done in the past because of the fully concurrent computational model. There's not really like anything that I can say right now that will like lower the sort of like way your brain will be twisted when you start to write concurrent code, but that's fun and you'll conquer it, and so like that's new and a lot different. Also, if you have experience developing, like especially on Ethereum or another smart contracting platform, a lot of that does transfer. It's not necessarily the exact way you'll write your code. That's going to be new and weird, but the intuitions that you build up about what needs to happen on-chain versus what needs to happen off-chain, what do we need consensus on versus like what can I run a lot faster in my web browser or in my Python client or wherever it is, that's all really useful background, and that's going to transfer over. So that's my take there.
And then in order to actually simulate the similarities between Ethereum and RChain, we actually went the route of creating an Ethereum sidechain and doing off-chain and on-chain architecture, which is quite similar to how RChain is going to be constructed in some manners, not completely, but and that's kind of how we simulated it from Ethereum's perspective instead of putting it all on chain. But when we did that, we realized that a lot of the components that we were putting off-chain, we could actually put on-chain with RChain. And that's like one of the big benefits for us because it allows us to have this type of trustless voting in our system and auditability for our voting, and we weren't able to do that otherwise with this sidechain type of infrastructure. So I think that was one way to actually start to architect your platform in a way that makes sense if you know how to use Solidity and develop on Ethereum. But just from a rolling perspective, you can keep me honest, but I think what most people say is that it's like the correct way to develop, except you just need to train your mind to think that way. And if you think that way when you're writing it, you'll actually be better off in the long run. It's just frustrating initially. You can keep me honest, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that, and I think as most programmers will have experienced this kind of shift of thinking already, right? Like going from programming just Angular into React, for example, this is a total mind shift as well, and it's just something you kind of have to pound against, and then you get it eventually. But I would also say from Resonate's perspective, I mean, I hope most of us saw the RSON demo this morning, and this, I think, itself represents a huge shift in terms of how we're thinking we're able to use RChain versus Ethereum. To be able to put this data on chain and moreover to encode metadata into audio files. And yeah, this is just revolutionary and something that we would never dream of doing with Ethereum. So yeah, we're looking forward to that.
Just to build on what Luigi was saying, this idea of if you've come from an Ethereum background, with RChain, you don't need to separate as much in terms of on-chain and off-chain. So for example, one of the things that we dealt with our Ethereum implementation is there's not a lot of data, but a fair amount of data that we wanted to put into the contracts themselves, but it's really expensive. So we would look into alternatives like using IPFS or something like that. With RChain, you don't have to do all that. You can just do everything on RChain. And the idea with the way that the shards will be set up is there'll be some that are tailored more for storing large amounts of data, like song data, and some that may not be. But so that you will, but in terms of the developer interaction, you can just deal with everything, most everything being on chain and not having to do things like hacks or work around the cost issues by using things like IPFS. Or another thing we did on Ethereum was leverage the log channels for attributing things about very specific IDs that we're creating. And we don't need to do any of that fancy stuff or goofy stuff with RChain. We can just do it all within the RChain contracts we're building. So that's definitely an advantage to the RChain architecture.
All right, so you've gotten to know our panelists and you've gotten to know what they're working on and how they've experienced that work so far. So I really would like to turn it over to the room and happy to take questions and continue a conversation here.
When architecting a new design and you want to get it as close to the final as you can, is there any best practices guideline for on-chain, off-chain, all these sort of things you've been talking about up there? Or do I have to sort of build it once and then build it again after I discover what I did wrong?
I don't know if there's any best practices, considering it's happening live in the sense that we're all like experiencing it at the moment. What I can say from looking at it in hindsight is just simply that you really need to be quite selective, especially with Ethereum, what you want to put on chain. I'm very much of the belief that not everything deserves to be on chain, and it's just a cost that you don't necessarily have to take. So I think when you architect your platform, you need to be very, very self-conscious as to, this is something that I need to be secure. Like, it's really important, and I want it to be transparent, or I want there to be an archive or something of that nature. That should be on chain. But other things that can go through AWS or something of that nature, it's not necessary to do that cost. And then I think Greg made a really good comment at the talk this morning about how Ethereum charges all the costs up front rather than amortizing. So you can put something on chain that perhaps you don't need in a week, but you still paid for all the gas up front. And anybody who's taken any economics class knows that you don't want to be doing that. Time value of money is a very simple concept. So, considering that when you're deploying contracts, I think is quite important as well.
Yeah, so like rules of thumb, I mean, you definitely have to address this on a case-by-case basis, but if it's sensitive data or private data, it shouldn't go on chain because, or at least shouldn't go on chain in clear text because everything in the blockchain is public. And I think a tripping spot as you're learning Rolang is we have this concept of unforgeable names. And so the computational model says if I put something on an unforgeable name, and I maintain control of that unforgeable name, I don't pass it to anyone else or send it out to anyone, then only I have access to it. And that's true within the computational model, but remember it's a blockchain and you can look into the blockchain from outside. So don't forget about circumventing the computational model from off-chain. I guess going the other way, if it's something that you need consensus on, like if you're writing a sports book, you need to all agree on who won that football game so the right person gets paid, that has to go on-chain. So those are just some kind of basic intuitions.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Actually, Emily will get you. We're going to take turns. Emily's got the mic on the other side of the room.
Hey, so you mentioned that you can now store more data on chain than you could on Ethereum. And I think you kind of touched on this, but don't you see that as being kind of risky because you end up you run the risk of clogging validators up with all of this excess data that doesn't need to be on chain? So, I mean, I guess this is kind of a continuation of that question of where do you strike that balance, more specifically for data storage? Because, like you said, there is a lot of data that might be relevant right now, but it's not relevant in a week. And I think you mentioned something about, does RChain handle that differently than Ethereum does? Because do you not, with Ethereum, I pay that upfront gas cost to store that data. Is that not the case on RChain? Do you actually, how exactly does that work when you're storing data on RChain, or how does the pricing of that work?
I think the pricing stuff is still being worked out, so I don't know that anybody on this panel is going to be able to talk too much about that, other than sort of general principles that disk space will be rented, basically, as opposed to an upfront cost that lives there forever. So that's one difference between Ethereum and RChain. The other thing that I'll say about RChain is this idea that there will be different shards, and each shard can be tuned for different purposes. So some may be really, really low latency, high transaction volume focused, and others may be focused on storing large amounts of data assets. And still others may be somewhere in the mix between those two. So that's one thing that's a little bit different about RChain and other blockchains is different shards actually can have different, to use a term, SLAs for some of those attributes for data and transactions.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So if that's the case, you can fine-tune each individual shard. What does the governance structure for that look like? Like, who is the one who can actually tune those parameters for each given shard?
So it happens kind of through market prices. So like when you start a new shard, you go through a Genesis block ceremony like we did this morning, and the Genesis validators can sort of have a sense of, you know, we all have really high storage capacity nodes, and like, yeah, we've got compute, but it's not great, or it's kind of average. So that's naturally going to be a, you know, that's a shard where storage is cheap and compute is expensive. And so if you have a dApp that's really compute intensive, that's not a good shard for, like, no one's going to stop you from deploying there. It's still permissionless, and they can't censor you without colluding. But that's like, you're not going to do that because it's a foolish economic decision. You'd rather go somewhere that better suits your needs. So yeah, it kind of is naturally driven that way.
Okay, so each shard has, like, there are market forces that drive which parameters tuned towards high latency or low cheap storage. It's all market forces.
Yeah, and then, you know, within each shard, you've also still got that same trade-off that you have in any blockchain, where smaller validator size is going to give you better performance, but a little bit less security, or co-locating validators will do the same. And so, you know, if you're running an application that really doesn't need to be that performant but needs high security, you're going to go to a shard with a lot of validators, and you're going to get a lot of good distributed consensus. And if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of consensus, you know, maybe it's a little more likely that validators will collude or something, but it's still within your tolerance, and you'll get better performance, you can do that. And so one of the cool things about the RChain architecture is that you don't have to make that decision across the board for everyone. So like Bitcoin has gone really hard, we need maximal decentralization and we're not worried about throughput. And then, you know, like EOS has kind of made more of a moderate trade-off. Well, with RChain, you get to choose whatever shard makes the trade-off that you're comfortable with and works for your economics.
I want to build on what Chris was saying. There is a concept of rent, and there's the economics, and those aspects you're going to see coming out in nodes 7 and 8, which would be both complete by end of this year, calendar year.
We've answered all of your questions
Look
for
at all
all
the dApps
time.
we're going to have.
You are now omniscient and fully acknowledged.
Hi, this is just an informational resources announcement. I'm Jonathan from Business Development in RChain. And just like Ethereum has a project that was developed by consensus for data oracles derived from Wolfram Alpha, we're working with that team at RChain. And if you go into GitHub, there's issue 888. We're polling the community for what sorts of data oracles you would like for your dApps. So if you need authoritative canonical information in real time from Wolfram Alpha, we will provide for you. And we hope to have those oracles available in Q1.
I don't see any.
Someone please interrupt me if I keep asking questions. But so going back to these shards. So you have this governance structure that is, you can switch around between shards based on kind kind of which shard is best for you in your use case. But what prevents someone, so let's say I'm on a shard with a low number of validators, which means that it's pretty efficient, it can go quickly, process a lot of transactions, and I build a dApp that's on top of this shard that is reliant on that attribute of this particular shard. What prevents someone else from saying, hey, this dApp is here and I kind of want to mess with it for the lulz, and flooding that shard with a bunch of validators, which then slows down the network and by proxy slows down my dApp? As a business owner, I'm going to be kind of pissed off about that. Is there anything that prevents people from making that happen?
So, okay, let me think out loud, and you guys can run this through your filters here. When someone's going to do that kind of high transaction volume on the shard, they're still going to have to pay their own flow fees. So if yeah.
So in order for, I think you made the suggestion that perhaps a lot of validators would come and slow down the shard.
Yeah, that was kind of based on, I don't have data that says that's going to happen. That was kind of based on what you guys said, yeah.
There are things that either stop or prevent or make them think twice about doing that, and one of them is bonding.
Okay, because they need to have basically the economic
yeah, and I don't think every shard is exactly the same in terms of what they need to bond.
And at the end of the day, it falls back to economic principles, right? The validators themselves are validating to earn money, right? They're not just doing it for the fun of validating. So whatever that shard is tuned for, if somebody were to try to come in and disrupt that, and I don't know that that's totally possible with the way that sharding is going to happen in RChain, so I don't want to speak authoritatively on that subject. But economically, though, it would seem kind of foolish to do that because they would basically be cutting their ability to earn any money on it.
Right,
so.
But they wouldn't be actively penalized. They would only be, they would just be risking opportunity cost of properly allocating their resources on other shards, correct?
Right.
Yeah, they wouldn't be penalized other than any of the other slashing conditions within Casper. So,
right.
But yeah, I think with respect to how the bonding works, they would think twice, and also with respect to making the economic decision, how many transactions are actually happening on this shard. Now that we add all these validators, the fees will probably be a lot lower with respect to what they were previously. So it's pretty much like any other market. If they have a bunch of land and people want to develop on it, if everybody tries to go bid up the price of the land, what's going to happen? The price is going to go up. But if you all do that at the same time, your forward return is a lot lower. So it's going to be the same economic decision.
Right. So, but in theory, sorry, and again, it's early on, so I'm sure maybe you guys haven't fully thought it through, but in theory, if someone wasn't economically motivated here, but just maliciously motivated and happened to have the capital to do so, then something like this could be possible where they could join a shard and start tweaking parameters to either drive up costs for storage or something along those lines. That's in theory possible.
Right, and so that brings up a good point, which is just across the board, the shards have to be economically sound to begin with. That's true of almost all blockchain technology, right? Even Bitcoin, right? There's a dollar value you can apply to 51% attack it, but it's a large dollar value. And so that's true of proof-of-stake networks as well, right? So the question is, what's the dollar value to maliciously do that? And what remains to be seen, but it will probably, for most shards that you would trust, be a sufficiently large dollar value.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if all these validators do join, then you have a situation where that shard is actually quite secure now. So you did get some benefit for this, and it's probably a good question for Vlad, but if they're intending to be malicious and they're not signing blocks or they're not validating, then there are a amount of slashing conditions where they, could potentially be hurt economically. So those are things that have been thought about. Perhaps there are better experts than us on it, but
and I don't want to speak for. It is possible, I guess, conceivably possible that shards could be set up with rules in place that there are certain SLAs that need to be met, and it's not quote unquote just economic decision-making with open permissionless validators being able to join. It's conceivable that you could set a shard up where the validator list is fixed.
Right.
And I
That's
think
not,
it's by region too, right?
right. So that's not, you could potentially set shards up that way as well.
Right. I guess I have another follow-up, but if someone, please take the mic away from me if someone else has a question. I don't want to hog it. Okay, cool.
You are using the time very well.
Do you want to come sit up here on the stage with us, dude? 'Cause, like,
No, that looks like a much more terrifying chair. I will sit down here.
be okay with
Okay,
me.
so I mean, what do these shards look like then? So are you envisioning
Purple?
them to be but are they big? Are they industry specific? Or like, I'm not gonna have one shard for my dApp, right? I'm gonna be joining in on a shard that's shared between tons of different dApps. So going against what you were saying, like, the bigger these shards are, the more difficult it's even possible to do something like that, or makes it to make something like that possible. So do you envision these shards to be like industry specific, not dApp specific? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think music's a great example, right? You know, if you saw the opening keynote when Greg talked about the storage cost, and when he said, even at 1/10 of the price, you know, and I'm thinking, $1,000 to pay $1,000 to host a song, you know. And he used a great example though. He said, "Let it be." I think was an example of a song where you could easily imagine $1,000 storage cost because it's something that you want to persist for all time. But in the case of industry specific, yeah, it's, you know, we're in intellectual property. And so I think we're going to have multiple layers where you're going to have nodes that are going to deal with storage, plus the connection of metadata and the smart contract. You know, the actual music files are not in the consensus mechanism, but the smart contracts allowing the access are. But then you've got multiple layers up. How do 10 million people interact with a song? With sharing and playlisting and curation and all that, that's going to happen another layer up in a completely different shard. So I think it really does, you know, it does speak to very complex structuring of how things are arranged and case by case. But this is one of the, as we're discovering, this is one of the beauties of RChain that we get to do is to think about that kind of stuff.
So do you envision dApps being like actually working across different shards too? Like parts of your application might be using smart contracts on different shards?
You're going to say yes?
What's that?
I said, I hope you're going to say yes.
Oh, yeah, okay, well, so, you mean anybody can keep me honest here. So there's been some revision in the sharding design, like, that we've kicked around over the last couple months. And so what's going to be live for Mercury is a tree-based model of sharding, and there's some good docs. Like, the best way to find them at this point is like join up with GitHub or Discord and ask people where like some sharding docs are. So like in Mercury, what's going to be transferable between shards is rev and not data. So a goal, as far as I understand, is that in later releases, we're going to try to get closer to the original lattice model of storage, or of sharding, where processes and data are actually mobile cross-shard. That's on a more distant horizon at the moment. But then I also wanted to just address a little bit of your last question, which was about like, how are these shards going to form? You know, it wouldn't be like one dApp per shard or whatever, and the sort of, you know, I think we had some really good hypotheses and suggestions about what's really likely to happen there. The hard rule, though, is there are no rules about when or where or how shards form. Anytime you can get a group of Genesis validators together that come to consensus on the state of the Genesis block, you just formed a shard. So if you want a shard for your dApp and you can get the validators that you care about to, you know, sign that Genesis block and make a shard, that's great. It's also possible that there'll be some that are like geographically based, because I spend a lot more money with people that are near me than I do with people across the world, or that are industry based, or maybe interest group based. Like, you can imagine maybe there's a shard for video games where you can like transfer assets between your games or something like that, so they'll want to be on the same shard. So yeah, there's no hard and fast rules. That you can create one anytime you like.
I think you may also have this situation where shards are set up in a sense that they're all performing for the same thing. So you may have a mission critical shard where you have like stock settlement or financial transactions, but you probably wouldn't have CryptoKitties on that shard. You'd have something, another shard where it'd be like Facebook and Twitter likes being confirmed, because that's what the validators think that they can optimize for, economically. So I think it might not be industry specific, but more what the validators think that they can earn in terms of forward return.
So it's definitely something important that you have to think about if you're developing on this platform or you're looking to develop on this platform is what shard do I want and what attributes in a shard am I looking for? That's a really big piece of this then, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. I would also articulate that, again, the economic incentive to attack a shard is really important. And so I don't think we're going to see millions of shards, right? Because it's going to be too easy to economically attack really small shards. So on launch of RChain, there will be the root shard for sure. And I suspect we're going to have most apps deploy there. I guess we could maybe have a great pool or bet on when the next shard forms. Like I'd love to see the over/under on that one.
Put that in a smart contract.
I was just write my first app.
Yeah. So I was a high school teacher for a bunch of years, and I have a suspicion that there's someone sitting out there being like, oh, I have a question that I want to ask, and I'm just a little nervous to ask it, and I've been that person a bunch of times, so you should
There are
do
no stupid questions, just stupid
we would
people.
love to.
No, I mean,
not to silence,
stupid
you're
answers.
doing-
I may have.
You're nailing it. You're doing a great job.
Just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, there's stupid answers, and I'll have plenty of them.
Yeah, right.
Was that an arm going
I
up?
saw that guy raise
No, that
his
was a
hand.
stretch. That was just a stretch.
Okay, so this really may be a stupid question. I'd just like to hear you talk on your attitude to identity and whether we're looking at people only being able to use one identity, and just both at a development level, but also I come from the artistic context, so I'm interested. I've worked for many years with people who are running 5 artistic identities at once, and they're interacting with each other. So I'm kind of, yeah.
You want to talk about the personas?
Yeah, I can start with that. So kind of a fundamental part of the way that Resonate's streaming service will be set up in the Creative Passport as well is with the assumption that musicians generally have more than one identity, right? Like I have my root identity, which represents myself, and then I have any number of identities on top of that, which are like my jazz saxophone project and my sound art project, et cetera, et cetera. So in our integration with LifeID, we're very lucky because LifeID has the kind of opinion that for every service I join into, I'm issued a different decentralized identifier. And in that way, my activity can't be correlated between services. So we have the same attitude towards personas. So I have one self-sovereign identity for my jazz saxophone and another for my sound art. And important part of the Creative Passport is that with these identities, I create different social networks, essentially. So I use my one identity to sign the identity of my collaborator, and then we're linked for that persona, and then for this other persona, I have, like a separate identifier, and I can use that to form a social web all of its own. So yeah, I think we are all of the attitude that, every person plays multiple different roles and might want those roles to be separated and assume that we want them to be separated. So that's how we're working with it.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. And just to add to that, the word identity, it means, I bet you every one of us probably has a different idea if I would ask you, what's your identity? What LifeID is building is a platform for people to have digital identities or identities in the real and digital world, sorry. But it's premised on this really fundamental issue, which is you create a unique identifier for each relationship you have. And the reason for that is twofold. One is to allow you to have different relationships and not have you use identifiers that can be correlated across them. And the other is for this idea that some people do want to set up multiple personas for different things that they're doing. So it accomplishes basically both of those things. And then one other things I'll just say about, because identity is really a sensitive topic, and it relates to use, it kind of relates to the earlier question about what do you put on the chain. And it's really important that everybody understand that Life ID and most identity projects understand that we don't put personal information on chain. Because the chain, at least public chains, I know there's private chains and you could argue whether you should use them or trust them or whatnot, but for a public blockchain, whatever you put there is public. Even if it's encrypted, it's still public. And we at Life ID, and it comes from me, believes that if it's encrypted, there will be a day where that encryption key becomes known. So it's not even necessarily safe to put encrypted data on the chain. So that's the attitude that we take, and our architecture is built such that we don't store any of your personal data on chain. All of your personal data is stored somewhere where you control, usually either your mobile device and some cloud provider that you trust. Usually that's a walled, provider of some sort where you can back up that data.
Do you have plans to like shard that stuff itself, where you could split that up among several cloud providers so that there's no way that anyone could pull it off of that?
Yeah, it's basically a plugin. So you could have some of your information stored in one place and some stored in another place if you wanted to.
We've also talked a bit about backing up to your network, right? So like sharding, encrypting sharding, and then backing it up to like different people in your social web or your friends, I guess, in the case of the Life ID app. So, yeah.
That was a good question.
We're about at time. Does anybody else have any question that you'd like to ask? All right, well, as with all things RChain, this is the start of an ongoing conversation. You've seen their faces, you've known their names. Please don't hesitate to talk to them over the course of this conference. Sorry, I just made that invitation on your behalf. But I think it's important that this is the start of a conversation, whether it's here at the conference or whether it's on any of the channels where people are having conversations about this. It's important for you to take a few seconds before you leave the quiet of this room and go into the hustle and bustle of that room to maybe make a decision about what you're going to do next based on what you learned here now. And as you're making that decision, I will turn your attention to the program. You've heard today from dApp developers, people who are working with the RChain platform, what kind of thought has gone into that, what kinds of decisions they've made as a result of that. But if you're very new and you want to stay on this track, I highly recommend you stick around for learning how to deploy and interact with rolling smart contracts. You're going to hear from Kent and Michael Birch, who have been writing a lot of rolling contracts, and they can share a lot of lessons learned. They can really help you get started. They might also blow your mind a little bit, and that's okay. When they talk, sometimes I just follow the verbs and hope for the best. Also, to call out, as you look on day 2, if you're a developer and rolling scares you after the session that you're in today, please come back tomorrow for CryptEffects, which is a tool that will help you work with rolling. Is in a kind of an editing way, so that if you walk out of here today and feel very uncomfortable with what rolling has to offer, please come back to learn about CryptEffects tomorrow. I think you'll feel better. Also, we're going to hear more from Joshi on your work tomorrow, as well as all of these guys are going to be on stage either later today or tomorrow to talk more specifically about their projects. And then I highly recommend tomorrow afternoon, 14:45, coming back. A lot of the questions we heard today are great questions to ask again with the dev team tomorrow afternoon. As they've said, this platform is still in development. We've got nodes 7 and 8 to try and get us to mainnet. There are still a lot of features that are coming in. To be very honest, there's a lot of features that still have opportunity to be adjusted and changed. Nothing is locked in stone ever on this project. But we want to hear that from you, and these questions help inform what's important, just as their questions have helped inform where we got to the platform as it is today. So with that, I'd very much like to thank you for your time and for sharing your information today, and very much thank you for being here. Well done.
Okay.
I just wanted to say one final thing. All this work that I'm getting credit for is at least half done by a dude named Dan Connolly who couldn't be here because of passport issues. So I get all the glory, and he did a lot of the work.